As we celebrate Valentine's Day weekend, we wanted to consider marriage as the gift and grace that it is. I know in the past, about a month ago or more, we focused on reconciling our marriages to the Lord, and that this is more focused on the sacrament and the grace and the virtue and the sanctification of self and spouse that marriage calls us to, the vocational call. So we're just focused on that as we recognize the call to love, especially in marital love, in the sacrament of marriage. The first reading in the book of Sirach, we see this image of choosing life and death, and it shows this image of fire and water. I don't know if there's sort of like a mistranslation there, or, the fire and water, one is life and one is death. Maybe it's the fires of hell and the waters of life. But, just at its base reading, or in the English at least, it's clear that you can use fire and water for good, right? You can cook your food, you can keep warm, especially in our super cold weather right now, and you need water to sustain ourselves, to live. But there's the capacity also to harm, right? When we have fire, if we reach out our hand to it, we can burn ourselves, we can hurt ourselves, we can hurt others with fire. Fire can do great damage. And then water as well. We could drown in water, we can drink too much water, we can hurt ourselves in different ways. And so it's how we utilize what we've been given, fire or water, the gifts of God's love, to understand them and to order our hearts and minds to use what God has given us in a way that's for our good and the good of others. In the second reading, we see this call for this. The Spirit scrutinizes everything, even the depths of God. This isn't a lack of trust in God. This is a recognition of entering into the depths of God's love. This recognition that we need to understand God's love, we need to scrutinize, to test, to understand, to be able to receive what God gives us, himself, his love for us, to understand who we are so that we have the capacity to love others. This call and response, this reception, and then the ability to give ourselves more fully, to make ourselves clean channels of God's love, to receive clearly and to give purely without getting in the way of God's grace, love, and mercy, especially in marital love. And then in the gospel, we see this graphic imagery of plucking out your eye or cutting off your hand, specifically in the context of marriage, in the ways in which we potentially cause harm to our spouse. We want that hyperbole to tear it off or cut it off, pluck it out, to get rid of it so as to not affect the goodness and grace and virtue that the sacrament of marriage is meant to produce, this gift of self. We see most explicitly in the sacrament of marriage this call that Jesus gives us, the image of giving himself to the church, is the image of the family. In fact, we call the family the domestic church because it bears witness to Christ's love for his church, giving his life for his church to bear fruit. We say that same reality in the sacrament of marriage. There's the concrete gift that we see in the greatest gift that can come from marital love is children, but just being, even if you can't have children, being life-giving, seeking virtue and goodness, and there is a fruitfulness in marital love even if there's no children. So Jesus gives us that image, that witness in the domestic church of how spousal love bears witness to Christ giving himself for the church and that call to fruitfulness. And so this imagery of cutting it off or plucking it out or getting rid of it so that it doesn't cause harm to other it's extreme. It's a hyperbole. It says that we need to be aware of it and to work towards it, but the recognition that we need help in it. It's not possible to love as God is calling us to love without first scrutinizing everything, recognizing God's love, receiving God's love, and loving in that way in which he loves us, gives us the capacity to love other. We can't even love ourselves as we ought, let alone someone else. And in the intimate and self-gift way that Jesus shows us on the cross is impossible. It's impossible for us to love as Jesus calls us to love without first receiving his love, without first recognizing his love for us. And so this is where that forgiveness, that grace, that goodness that God gives us in his love for us. In this week's bulletin, there's an examination of conscience for couples, and this is not to focus on the sin itself, it's to give the sin to the Lord so that he can heal us, first forgiving us from our sin, but weakness unto itself is not a problem. It's part of what we are as human persons, and God works through our weakness. In fact, the greatest witness of love is Jesus at his weakest on the cross, dying literally, physically, for love of his church. And he wants to utilize our weaknesses to bear witness to his love for others. So the weakness is not a boundary or a barrier to loving as God calls us, but it is an opportunity to ask for God's grace and goodness, to recognize our weakness and see how God is calling us to love as he loves, especially in the sacrament of marriage. There's two ways I want to talk about how we maybe can help inspire that reality, the recognition that we don't have the capacity to do it by ourselves, by our own merits, by our own strength, recognizing our weakness. So how are we called to do what God is calling us to do? Well, we're called to pray, to be in relationship with God, to recognize what we need and asking for the grace to love our spouse as we ought, as God calls us. We need to be in relationship with God, to scrutinize ourselves, our words, our actions. One of the dynamics of the Sermon on the Mount, the gospel reading, which we continue today, the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, is that consideration from the head to the heart, from the action to the internal, to the external, to the internal. So what's going on inside matters, so that we can act as God is calling us to act. We have to consider, to scrutinize our heart and purify it so that we can give ourselves fruitfully to those we love, especially in marriage, in the gift of ourself to our spouse. And so that prayer, that praying for your spouse, praying for their needs, praying for their good, praying that their hearts be opened and that they receive what they need as we receive what we need from our relationship with God, that relational love of God gives us the capacity to be in relationship better with those we love, especially spouses in marriage. And then the second way that marital love can sort of grow in an understanding of virtue and holiness and grace and goodness is praying together, as we recognize that we don't have the capacity to do what God is calling us to do without receiving what we need from the Lord in that marital union, in that mission that you're united to do good for your spouse and to do good as a couple, to support each other, to grow in virtue, to seek holiness for ourselves and for our spouse. We recognize we need to be united in prayer, in mission. If we're not praying together, if we're not sharing that deep reality of our heart, what we're called to do in our actions, we don't have the capacity to work together as we should. It's impossible to do it by ourselves. And so we need to ask the Lord in our prayer as a family to help us. My parents have been doing marriage enrichment for several years, and they did marriage prep. And one of the gifts they give the couples as they prepare for marriage is the gift of the praying husband and the praying wife. So the power of the praying husband and the praying wife. So praying for each other and praying with each other and sharing that prayer together in recognition of how God calls all of us, but in a specific way, the couple, the spouse, the marital union in mission to bear witness to his love in the world. So that prayer, personal prayer for our spouse in our personal prayer, and then prayer together as a couple is such an essential aspect of unlocking God's goodness. In and through our weakness, scrutinizing our hearts and our minds, making sure that our minds and our hearts are united in our words and our actions, to not be afraid of our wounds, but see how God is calling us to grow and to be healed and to bear witness to his love through our weakness, through God's grace, through Jesus Christ. And so let us continue to unite our hearts and minds to the Lord, recognizing how he calls to love as he loves, especially as we see Jesus loving his church on the cross.